Hi, everyone. This is your chief investigative reporter, Sam Smink, and I have a subject today that I think you're going to really be interested in. Have you ever wondered how to get public records from different agencies across Connecticut, or what you're even allowed to get? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to bring in a very special guest, Russell Blair. He is with the FOIA Commission, and he's going to help us talk through all this. Russell, I guess the first thing, if you could help explain what the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Commission, is.
Yeah, certainly. It's great to be here. I really appreciate you guys talking about this topic. I think it's so important. And the Freedom of Information Commission, really, our whole job is to try to help residents of the state find out what their government is doing. So Connecticut has a Freedom of Information law, and basically what it means is that government needs to have its meetings open to the public, and that people can make requests for government records. And I think the biggest thing I think people might be surprised about is just how much information out there is public information about, how school budgets are, being spent, information from police departments about investigations and arrests, information about land use applications, that new apartment building in your neighborhood, what is it going to look like? Where is the drainage going to go? All these questions and these things that are happening in our communities. The Freedom of Information Act and the Freedom of Information Commission are really there and designed to allow you to get that information, understand what your government is doing, whether it be state or local. And I think the really important part is that when you have that information, then you can participate in the process. You can go to public meetings, you can raise your concerns, you can talk to the media about issues in your community, and you'll have those records and that knowledge to be able to help support your arguments.
Yeah, and I think it's what you're saying about the fact that this isn't records and freedom of information isn't just for the media. It's for the public. I mean, if you're a parent and you're hearing something at a Board of Education meeting you don't like and you want to know more about it, you have the right to access those records.
Yeah, I think that's something that's so important. And I think oftentimes people think of FOI as, it's for the media or for its attorneys, or they think that this is something that is really difficult and, you have to go to law school and I would never be able to know how to do it. It's really as simple as just making a written request for what information you want. And, sometimes the tricky part can be you have to make it to the right person. So sometimes you got to figure out, who has those records. But if you're looking for information from the Board of Education, you can send an email to the superintendent's office. If you're looking for information, from a police department about an arrest report, you can go down there, you can visit the records window, and you can ask them for copies of a police report. The whole idea, the whole premise of the law is that it's supposed to be simple, and the commission is here to make sure the government is following the law. So if you go to your local Board of Education and you're trying to get information and they're telling you no, or you're experiencing excessive delays, then you can file a complaint with the commission. There's no cost for that. And the commission, we're state employees and our job is to try to help people get the information that they're looking for. So if you get told no, you also have a way to try to challenge that decision, and the commission will make sure you get everything that you're legally entitled to receive.
And public records don't have to be scary. We think, again, that you have to write this big, long diatribe. And sometimes there are agencies that will make you cite specific things with the Freedom of Information Law. But a lot of it's just as simple as writing, I would like to see this record.
Yeah, I'll give you an example I shared in another presentation I did, just because I think it sort of maybe will help to connect to some of your viewers. I used to be in the media. I used to be a newspaper reporter, and I remember when I would be driving home at night, I'd be going past this location, and I saw they were building something, and it looked like it was going to be some kind of restaurant. And I was at the age and the time where I was eating a lot of drive-through food, and so I was just curious, what is this new restaurant going to be, right? Is it something that I'm going to be interested in? And so I emailed the city planning office and said, hey, can I see the plans for the property at such and such address? And they sent me a copy, and then I was very happy when I found out that it was a Taco Bell with a drive-through, so that I'd have a new place to stop on my way home from work. So it could even be something as simple as that. You see something in your community, you just want to know what it is. Maybe your kid comes home from school and they're talking about some policy and you say, I want to see the policy, right? They're telling me about this new cell phone policy. Well, I want to see what it says, right? Maybe I want to talk to the Board of Ed about it. Maybe I think there's a change they can make to see it better. So all those things and curiosities that we come across in our lives, if there's some aspect of government involved, if you're interested, you can probably find out something about it.
And one thing I learned from you, because the FOIA Commission is there to answer both questions from the media and questions from the public about how to ask things, is that I can't just, by law, agencies don't have to just answer my question. So I'm going to give a little bit of example, and you've heard this because I asked you this. I wanted to know if a state employee had been put on administrative leave. So I simply asked that. And they responded saying they did not have to respond. This is a personnel issue. But you told me that, per law, they don't have to answer a question. But once I made a request to say, I'd like to see the record related to this employee and their current status, that's when they have to answer. And I did got a piece of paper that said they were on administrative leave. Can you explain a little bit of that difference?
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing, especially, it's very, very also especially important for the public to understand. And is that, the law does not require them to answer questions. The law does not require them to do research. They have to provide copies of public records. So the name freedom of information is almost a little bit misleading because it doesn't mean I can just call up government, ask them all these kinds of questions, or ask them to, create some special report for me or something like that. You have to ask for copies of records. So for your viewers and anybody else who's watching, everyone should be thinking of what are the records that you can ask for. So like in the example you raised, yes, if I call and ask, was that teacher placed on leave, they could say, well, we're not going to answer that. But if I say, I would like a copy of a letter, putting that person on leave, well, then they would have to give me a copy of that letter if one exists. So it's an important distinction, but again, the law really operates in terms of public records. The good news is the definition of what is a public record is really quite broad. It's any data or information pertaining to the public's business. So it is quite a broad definition. So the universe of public records is really pretty vast. So a lot of information out there that people can ask for. Again, there are some limitations. We could talk about that a little bit too. There are some types of items that they don't have to provide, but if they're not going to provide you with a record, there needs to be a legal basis for that. It can't be that we don't like somebody. It can't be that we disagree with them politically. If they're not going to give you a record, there needs to be a legal basis for that. And if you don't get, a legal basis, then that might be something you could challenge at the FOI Commission to say, I don't believe that there's a legal reason that they can withhold this information.
What are some of those things that are exempt? Like I know sometimes police, and the law is very broad, so a lot of the times it does seem to be like it's at their discretion. When something's an open investigation, I know a lot of things can sometimes be exempt.
Yeah, with law enforcement, there are a number of exemptions for things like witness statements, identities of certain victims. There's one exemption that sort of protects the integrity of an ongoing investigation. One example might be if there is a situation and there's an investigation and no arrest has been made yet, they're allowed to withhold more information while they're pursuing an arrest warrant, perhaps. And then on the other end, there's also circumstances like if somebody gets arrested and they're found not guilty, and the case is dismissed, we have an erasure statute, which means that after a certain period of time, they're not allowed to disclose information about those arrests. So, law enforcement, there's exemptions there. Body camera footage, that's something people are often interested in. Those are public records, body camera videos. But depending on what's on the video, they might redact or blur out certain things if there were minors present, juveniles. If there was somebody undergoing medical treatment, they might remove that portion of a video. But if you have an interaction with the police, or somebody has an interaction with the police, and there's a body camera video, that's something that you can request under the FOI law.
And then I know personally, just covering some recent cases, a lot of people have wanted us to get DCF records, but those are the law's pretty clear that they don't really have to release that stuff. Can you explain?
Yeah, the Department of Children and Families, DCF, they have a pretty broad investigation, or sorry, a pretty broad exemption for their investigations. So a lot of the time, if they are involved, then there's going to be far more limited disclosure. If you were involved in a DCF case, they might give you certain information, but a lot of that is sort of, discretionary that they can decide. So DCF is one of those areas where, there's not a lot of disclosure under FOI. Another one I'll just mention because people ask about this sometimes. So court files are public, but the process is a little bit different. You cannot make an FOIA request for specific documents in a court file, but typically, this is not under the Freedom of Information Act, but you can go to a clerk's office in a courthouse, and you can inspect and review court files. So court files are public. It's just a little bit of a different process there.
And then what about personnel records? You and I both do a lot of work with the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government, which is an agency that, tries to educate the public and educate lawmakers and agencies about what is and isn't available. So what about personnel records? Because I actually get a lot of questions from viewers about that.
Yeah, so with personnel records, the way the law works is they are supposed to disclose any information unless they believe disclosure would be an invasion of personal privacy. And that is a pretty high standard. There was a Supreme Court case in Connecticut going on, I think 30 plus years ago, where our Supreme Court found that for something to be an invasion of personal privacy for a public employee, disclosure of that information needs to be both highly offensive and not pertain to a matter of public concern. So, for example, disciplinary records of state employees, those should be made public. Attendance records of state employees, those should be made public. Salary information, job descriptions, things that are related to job performance, good, bad, or indifferent, those are records that generally should be made public. Now, the challenge is that when there is a privacy concern, the state agency or the local agency, by law, they are supposed to consult with the employee, and the employee is allowed to object. But what we see sometimes is that they will ask the employee whether they object or not for things that are really not objectionable, and that can just cause an excessive delay in the process. When I do a lot of trainings for public employees, and we talk about this issue, and one of the things I say is, the standard, again, it's invasion of personal privacy. It's not things that are embarrassing. It's not things that we would prefer not to see in the newspaper or on the Channel 3 news. It's not. That's not the way the law works. If you do something wrong and you get in trouble and you get reprimanded as a public employee, the public is entitled to find that out. And, that is one of the things that comes with being in the public sector and working in public services. Public employees are open to a higher level of scrutiny, but that's because that's kind of what the Freedom of Information Law is all about, is allowing the public to understand how its government is operating, whether its government is operating effectively, efficiently, whether there's issues, all those types of things.
And one of the big questions you and I have gotten often from the public, because we've gone out through CFOG and talked, and the FOIA Commission talked to the public, is how long does someone have to respond to you?
Yeah, the law doesn't have a specific time period other than if you ever make a request, you are supposed to get a response just to acknowledge your request within 4 business days. But in terms of getting copies of the records you've requested, the law says that they have to provide you with access promptly. So there's no specific definition, which can be good and bad. Good in that it allows for flexibility, bad in that sometimes, you might be waiting for months and months and months. So my advice would be, if you make a request and, you think a reasonable period of time has gone by and you're not getting the information, and that they might not be prompt, then that is something that could be the subject of a complaint to the commission. So I should mention too, the Freedom of Information Commission, a little bit about how we work. Again, if you don't get records that you're looking for, you can file a complaint with us. This year we're going to receive almost 1,200 complaints between the state and local government. And every complaint, we will look at it, we will review it, we will hold a hearing if necessary. We will bring in witnesses who will talk about that records request and why they didn't give certain records, or if they don't have certain records, they would have to testify to that. So it's a great process. And again, if you're experiencing excessive delays, sometimes filing a complaint can help to speed that up, because the commission might order them to produce records within a certain period. We might say they've got to give you anything outstanding within 30 days. If you don't file a complaint with the commission, then they're supposed to be prompt, but if they're not, things could drag on and on and on.
But the process with the commission, it bears warning that, that can take a decent amount of time too. But, if you're not getting answers to your questions, you need some help sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. The commission process is involved. It can take a while. And, the longest it can take is we have to complete every case within a year of when it's filed. So, sometimes it can be a months-long endeavor at the commission. But a couple things I'll mention is one, sometimes the act of filing the complaint will get the people to comply. The agency now has not only your FOI request, but now they've got a complaint with a ticking clock on their desk. And so that's an incentive sometimes for people to deal with these matters and try to resolve them so they don't have to go to a hearing and all that. And the other thing too is, again, we have that 1 year clock, but if you don't file a complaint, we had a case on our commission meeting this week that was a request that was made all the way back in 2023 and still had not been completed. So, sometimes there are circumstances where people are waiting years for records. If you file a complaint with us, it may take up to a year. But the other thing I tell people is, we will make sure you get everything you're entitled to. And one thing, your viewers might find interesting is that if an agency is withholding records or they're withholding portions of records, we can order them to submit those to us, unredacted, fully complete, and we will go line by line and make sure that they give you everything that you're entitled to. And some of our decisions, if you read them, we go literally like word by word. We might say that they give you paragraphs 1 and 2, they can redact paragraph 3 and 4, but they have to give you paragraph 5 and 6. So our attorneys, they meticulously look through all this. And if there's not a legal reason why some information can be withheld, then we will order that agency to give you those records.
Frankly, it's a great resource. I don't think a lot of people really know is there, so I appreciate you coming on. Another question we get quite a lot is, can agencies charge for these records?
Yes, so there are fees under the Freedom of Information Act. They're allowed to charge, but they're really quite nominal, and really they are more, I think one way to think about it is it's more for the medium and sort of the storage device. And what I mean by that is, if you want paper copies of records, they can charge you 50 cents per page. If you want digital versions of records and they're emailing them to you, there is no charge for that. If they have to put them onto a flash drive or a CD or a DVD, they can charge you for that device that the records are going on to. But I think one of the best things about Connecticut's law in terms of making it accessible is that the law does not allow for hourly labor charges. So if it takes a clerk 3 hours to work on a request, they can't bill for that time to the requester. And one of the reasons I think that's not allowed, and really sort of the act doesn't call for it, is because this is part of the job of government, right? When I'm spending time fulfilling FOI requests, that's one of my job responsibilities, right? And my salary is paid for by the taxpayer. So this is work that we're being paid to do as part of our jobs. So certainly if you get a really large request, I would just tell people, be willing to maybe work with your town or with the state agency to try to narrow the scope of things, because sometimes that can help you to get things quicker. But, even if it's a large request, it doesn't mean that they get to charge differently. So you can make large requests. It might take longer. But a lot of times, I think the way to think about it is digital things are generally going to be available at no charge, or again, a disc or a DVD or a USB. They cannot charge you for the hours that somebody spends working on your request.
I'm glad you mentioned about being specific with your requests, because it can really help sometimes get your answers quicker and sometimes get your answers. If you are asking for a large amount of stuff, and maybe this agency isn't even sure, where to start. So it does really help being as specific as you can.
Yeah, I'll just give one sort of real story, I think, that kind of hones in on that point. I was dealing with a complaint with a school district and a parent once, and the initials of the child of this parent were AM. And so they were asking for emails and conversations about their children. And one of the things they said was anything that contained AM. Well, if you think about a school and you think about AM, things were turning up like the lunch menu and the bell schedule and all this stuff that had nothing to do with the issue at hand. And so, through communication, they were able to work together with the parent and figure out some search terms and figure out, whose emails were they most interested in. And so they worked together to narrow the scope and make it something that was doable and achievable. And the person was happy with what they got. And so they were able to withdraw the complaint. So I think a lot of times, especially I feel like in 2025, everything is online and we're in the digital age. I know we're doing this on Zoom, but I think sometimes picking up the phone, meeting with somebody, those can make things go a lot more smoothly. Before you make an FOI request, you could always call the agency and say, hey, I'm trying to find this out. Where do you think I should go? What types of records should I be asking for? And hopefully you get somebody who can help you with that. So that when you make the request, again, it's going to be targeted and it's going to be narrowed, and then you're going to hopefully get what you need, and you're not going to get a bunch of stuff that you don't really want that somebody has had to now spend time, locating and reviewing.
Yeah, sometimes I've just picked up the phone and that's made life a whole lot easier. And that's again where we go back to saying, public records requests don't have to be scary. I'm glad you also brought up the fact about what our law says about charging for time, because I used to work in Florida, and people should know that each state has their own public record freedom of information law. And, for example, in Florida, you pretty much could get your hands on everything that you wanted. There weren't many laws there wasn't many parts of the FOIA law that prohibited you from getting stuff. And, since I haven't been there since late 2019, and I know there's some bills that have changed that and stuff, but they were allowed to charge you for time. So sometimes we did have to be so specific because they would charge us for time. And I guess that's all me trying to get to the point of where do we kind of fall when it comes to other states in terms of freedom of information?
Yeah, I think Connecticut's law has always been seen as one of the stronger ones. For a lot of reasons. I think the definition of public records is quite broad. The fact that we have the commission, the fees are pretty nominal. One interesting thing, you talked about other states. There are some states where certain offices and parts of government are just not covered under FOIA. There's a few states where the governor's office, for example, does not
Massachusetts,
fall
I used to
under
work.
FOIA.
Yep.
Yeah, so in Connecticut, our governor's office is subject to FOI. So you could, if you wanted to know who the governor was meeting with, before there was a bill signing, you could ask to see the governor's calendar, and they would have to send you a copy of that, if there were meetings that he took with lawmakers or other interested parties, or email communications coming in or out of the governor's office. Those are public records and treated the same as any others. And again, there are exemptions, but I would just encourage your viewers, maybe just, file an FOI request with your town about something you're interested in, and just see what you get back. You'd be surprised, I think. And also sometimes I know that, I do a lot of trainings, talk to a lot of public officials. I know sometimes FOI can be a little bit adversarial, but I do find that there's a lot of people who do understand this. I think they do take it to heart. I think they do want to help their residents. And so, you'd be surprised maybe how easy it might be. You could send an email and you might get what you need that same day sometimes, depending on the town, or you can walk into your town hall and go to your town clerk and ask them, hey, can you help me out with something? I think there's a lot of people who, as long as you're polite and you understand, people are busy and that sort of thing, and you might not get it immediately, but, I think you should try it, and you'd be surprised at just what you can find out.
And I know Connecticut is pretty good in terms of the actual freedom of information, but we're still seeing in the legislature, bills that are coming through every session where they're kind of trying to close some of those holes. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it was this past session or 2 sessions ago, there was one time when our executive director, I thought, had a really kind of good sort of analogy. She called it sort of like death by 1,000 cuts. And I think that's the issue that we're up against every year with the Freedom of Information Act, is that I think most people in principle, they support the idea and government transparency. But what we always see happening is there'll be some incident, there's some situation that arises in one corner of state government, and then sometimes the solution or the proposed solution is some sort of piece of legislation. So, for example, higher education, there's been a bill the last few sessions that would exempt any information pertaining to teaching and research at state universities, making that all exempt under the Freedom of Information Act. Now, What we have heard from the proponents of this is that they're concerned about professors who are doing research in certain areas, including like climate change or gun control, and that they might receive threats and that sort of thing. And so, I can certainly understand that situation. The commission's position has been that, there are existing exemptions in the law, there are other mechanisms, there are ways to go about this rather than saying, we're going to have a broad exemption for all records related to university research. And, somebody might say, well, why is it important that we have records about university research public? Well, there was a story, I believe, last year and probably on Channel 3 where there was a professor at the University of Connecticut who ended up getting arrested because she was supposedly doing research in Florida at Disney World, and they found out that some of these expenses, were not really pertaining to legitimate research activities. So, there's a perfect example of why, there might need to be some visibility into research and having accountability for people who are getting public money to conduct research, and what are they doing and where are they going and how is that money being spent. So, I'm always wary of when there's a situation that happens and then people think the solution is to limit access to information. In another area, we know that there's been a lot of claims of voter fraud or people not being registered properly, and there's a lot of people out there who have questions about how elections are run. And then sometimes we see proposals that would limit access to voter information. And I feel strongly that, the best way to say our elections are being run correctly and that there's integrity in the process is to allow for transparency, because then, if people want to find out who voted, they can, get the list of people who voted. Voter lists are public records. So, I think having more transparency, I think, does help to make people feel more, the government is more trustworthy. I think when you start to limit access, I think people start to get concerned. And, even if there's a legitimate reason, I think our position is always, well, how do we work within the existing law? And perhaps there's a way to address this without, restricting access to information further.
Well, Russell, I just want to thank you so much. And in wrapping this up, can you kind of tell people where they may be able to reach you in the commission?
Yeah, our email address is very simple. It's foi@ct.gov. So if you have any questions, you're trying to file a request, you're looking for anything, please email us. I really feel like it's my job to try to be as responsive as I can. So, if you want to email me, if you want to call us, our phone number's on our website. Please reach out, and also, again, I do a lot of trainings and presentations. So, if you feel like your elected leaders in your town might be interested in doing a training, they could contact me as well. I think the biggest thing, like you said early on at the start, is just letting people know that this law is available to them. You don't have to be a journalist, you don't have to be an attorney, and letting them know that the commission is here to help. Our goal is to try to help people get the information that they need. And I really strongly feel that we do a good job at that. We're a small agency, but we really work very hard. And I know we all think this is really important, and we want people to be able to understand what their government is doing.
And you and I met through the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government. We have that resource. We also have the CCFOI, that's a Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission. They help, those battles against public records in the legislature. So I just want to thank you again for your time. You're truly an expert at the Freedom of Information law, something that we're celebrating 50 years on. So it's good. And thank you so much again. And viewers, please feel free to ask me questions, ask Russell questions. He just volunteered. So thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Sam.
All right. Have a good day.
All right. Take care.